Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Taimur Nabili. Less than 2 weeks after the Obama administration announced the end of combat operations in Iraq, and US troops have already been drawn back into combat. Despite the hype that surrounded the August drawdown, there was never any real doubt that US soldiers would continue to engage the enemy when necessary. But this latest series of violent incidents has again raised questions about the rationality of US policy and the difficulties of maintaining security in Iraq. Rawi Iraqi is in Baghdad and joins me now live. Rawi, just assess for us where we actually stand now, 2 weeks after the start of this drawdown. How many attacks have we seen? How serious have they been?
In the past week, there have been near daily attacks targeting the Iraqi security forces, the symbol of trying to bring law and order to this country, with near daily bombings, car bombs targeting patrols and checkpoints, and targeted assassinations against senior Iraqi army and police officers. Of particular note, of course, of particular importance was the brazen broad daylight attack that took place on Sunday against an Iraqi army base in eastern Baghdad. A very complicated attack against a base that less than 3 weeks ago was also attacked by a suicide bomber who managed to kill more than 50 army recruits who are lining up there to get paid their paychecks, or sorry, actually to apply for jobs, for new jobs there at the base. Now, the particular attack on Sunday was very complicated. We understand that at least 6 assailants were involved. A car bomb went off at the very first checkpoint, and that opened way for the remaining suicide bombers to wage their attack on the base. So actually an increasing level of sophistication and complication in the attacks here, Timur.
And of course, on that Sunday attack, we saw the involvement of US troops, which obviously immediately erases this whole idea that the troops are not going to engage in combat any longer. So how does Washington explain the whole hype behind the no more combat, and what exactly is the role of these troops now?
It's important to point out, Timur, that the involvement of U.S. soldiers in that attack on Sunday, they were actually drawn into fighting. They were not involved in direct combat that they had initiated. Now, that being said, all along, U.S. military generals on the ground have maintained that the rules of engagement of U.S. soldiers here do not change despite this gradual drawdown and the announcement of an end to combat operations. U.S. forces here still maintain the right to open fire under the onus of force protection. In fact, they actually still have the right to go out of their bases to carry out preemptive strike against areas where they believe attacks against them are emanating from. So no change in the rules of engagement as far as that's concerned. In that particular attack on Sunday, Timur, there were at least 100 U.S. soldiers based at that Iraqi army base to carry out their new stated role, which is to advise, train, and assist the Iraqi security forces. Now, they too came under attack, so they had to open fire under defensive measures. And it's also important that to point out that both U.S. military and Iraqi military generals are pointing out that their involvement, the U.S. soldiers' involvement, was in suppressive fire. In other words, they were not opening fire to directly kill those targets or those assailants, but actually to force the assailants to duck while another force steps in to contain the situation, that force being the Iraqi force on the ground during that attack, Timur.
All right, Rawi Iraqi in Baghdad. Thank you. Well, to discuss this latest violence in Iraq, I'm joined from Amman by Faiza Al-Ariji, an Iraqi blogger and activist. From Baghdad by Tahsin Al-Sheikhli, who's the civilian spokesman for the Baghdad security plan. And from Washington, D.C. by Patrick Clausen, Deputy Director for Research at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thank you all for being with us on the programme. Tahsin Al-Sheikhli, if I may begin with you. We saw violence in Baghdad on Sunday with the involvement of US troops, and it would seem to imply that the local security forces can't maintain order without US involvement. Do you agree?
No, I'm not agree with this. For many reasons. You know, for us, we believe that our forces is capable and able to handle the security here in Iraq, especially in Baghdad.
Well, you say that, but so far,
we don't need.
You say that, but what we have seen indicates that there is still a very strong tendency, and apparently an increasingly sophisticated one, to attack very important areas of Baghdad, and they're getting away with it.
Yeah, it happened. You know, it's not just in Baghdad. You know, many countries, it happens like this. Today there is a blast in Pakistan. You know, there is many countries now encountering the same challenge that we have here in Iraq. And we think that our security forces now, within the reliability, the enough reliability to encounter the challenge that we believe in it. Like, you know, until now, the security forces succeeded to failed many attacks for Al-Qaeda and their alliances.
All right, well, let's go to Faiza Al-Ariji in Amman. Do you agree with that analysis? Baghdad is no more dangerous than a number of other cities around the world?
Well, first of all, I agree about the pulling out the troops from Iraq. I'm not with the staying of the occupation forces in my homeland. But in the same time, we have to talk about evaluation about how the security forces in Iraq and the army of Iraq, how are they functioning? We want to talk about facts on the ground. We will not talk about emotions. Yes, we appreciate their hard work for Iraqi
Well, what are the
officers.
facts on the ground as you see them?
Yeah, facts on the ground. If the Iraqi army and security, they have no right to have Air Force cover, Iraqi Air Force cover. The Apache is used by American officers. It's not allowed for Iraqi to be the driver of the Apache. So can you control any fight on the ground without the Air Force? Please,
Interesting point.
I would like to hear. I would like to hear the answer.
We'll come on to the exact nature of the relationship in just a minute. But let me go to Patrick Clausen and ask you about the actual role here. Let's for a start, dismiss this notion that perhaps combat operations are over. That was really only for American consumption at the end of the day. We know that those forces there will engage when necessary. The question is, are they going to be engaging all the time? Because it does seem as if there is no let-up in the violence in Baghdad, and there is still a great gap in the security forces' ability to cope with it.
Well, there is a lot of violence in Baghdad, but there has been a dramatic let-up from last year. There's many fewer people who are dying in Baghdad.
Let me stop you there for a minute, Patrick Lawson. This is the line we always hear from supporters of the American position. It's meaningless to say there's been a dramatic drop unless you define your time frame here. The fact is, we're not comparing relative to last year or the year before. We're saying there is an unacceptable level of violence still in Baghdad, and the security forces cannot deal with it.
We measure progress. Progress is compared to the past, and we have to ask, are we improving things? The answer is yes. And as Ms. Al-Khariji's pointed out, it's true that the Americans still provide the air cover, but that has only been necessary in about once every month or less often this year.
Mr. Al-Sheikli, let me bring it to you then. The situation in Baghdad, you know, we can look at it from any number of perspectives depending on what you want to see. But let me put this question to you on a purely theoretical level. Part of the reason, in fact, one of the central reasons given by the US for moving the troops out of Iraq was not simply that they thought that Iraqi forces could deal with it, but also central to the movement was this idea that the government was stable, that there was a functioning political process in Iraq. That is also not true. 6 months after the election, there is no government.
Yeah, okay. Before answering this question, let's agree. I think with your guests also, nobody here wants the Americans or foreign troops exist on the Iraqi lands. This is one of the things that I think it's a public demand for everybody. This is one. The second thing, even when the Americans were here before, there were many killed people every day. You know, during 2006, the Americans are here, and there were more than 200 people daily died. You know, now with our security forces, not more than 20, maybe within one month or 1 week sometimes, and it happens here and there, and our activities are more efficient than before. This is one. Okay, I am agree with you also. The political conflict that reflected its negative reflection on the security situation. But at the end, I think that it will be solved This is one of the problems that we have.
Okay, let me stop you there, because no one is denying that the aim is to reduce violence, and that perhaps everyone is hopeful that it will eventually happen. But Faiza Al-Ariji, let me ask you this: is there any value in comparing the violence to 2006, when it was at its peak, and pretending that this is progress? Should we not be comparing the violence to 2002, before the Americans arrived? Because it's certainly much more than it was then.
I would not like compare the violence in Iraq after 2003 and now 2010. No, I want to compare the powerful Iraqi army before 2003 and now, what we have gained. If we had in the past the strongest army in the region, it was the strongest army in the Middle East. Next year it will be 90 years since the establishment of Iraqi army. And what have we gained now? After Paul Bremer, he dismissed or he disbanded the Iraqi army in 2003, and they start to re-establish this institution on a new criteria. So what is the new criteria? Is it the quota? Do you think the quota is a very good, like will make you a professional army, a professional security institution, when you put quota for sectarian parties and ethnic parties? I guess this is a very weak point in the army and the security system in Iraq, and it will stay a weak point. So it will give the justification for the American troops to be back anytime to Iraq, to say, oh, they have weak army, they have also weak weapons. But if you compare the weapon now with Iraqi army compared with the weapons with the American army, there is no comparison.
All right. Well, Patrick Lawson, let me go to DC. I mean, the suggestion here is that this handover of power is something of a charade, that there's still a lot of U.S. control, and it's evident in the fact that the America still controls the airspace and a number of other avenues. What's the point of actually saying that there is progress under these terms?
The process of handing over to the Iraqis is going to take quite a while. The Iraqi Chief of Staff notes that it'll probably be 10 years before Iraq has a functioning air force that can take full responsibility for the defense of Iraq's borders. But it is a process, and Iraq has made remarkable progress from the days when the Iraqi army was completely devastated by the years in which Saddam was not able to provide resources to the Iraqi military, and the Iraqi army is much stronger than it was back under Saddam's rule. And it's building its strength every day. This is a slow process, but we see notable progress compared to a few years ago.
Mr. Al-Sheikhli, your office and your attempts to take over the security of Baghdad, tell me a little bit more about those, and tell me how you liaise with this new Office of Security and Cooperation in Iraq that's run by Americans. Who actually holds most of the power here?
Now, the Iraqi army, security forces completely run the security here in Baghdad. Maybe there were some consultants from here and there from our friends, but it's run completely by the Iraqi forces. But let me say something for your guest in Amman. Do you know all the security forces and the army officers now here in Iraq, they are from the former army? Most of the soldiers and the others from the former army. I think we have to believe, because they are Iraqis, and most of them, they served within the former army before they are now here. But now we are just, they are defending their country in a way maybe different than what Saddam Hussein regime at that time used for. Now they are defending their country against the terrorists, against the gangs that try to stop the democracy here in Iraq. But before they used to, most of them they killed not for a reasonable reason.
Okay, let's get a response from Faiza Al-Ariji.
Yes, I agree. We want a new Iraqi army who protect their people, who protect their country. I agree. We don't want the army or the security system or institute to kill Iraqis. I agree with you. But at the same time, I'm talking about the experienced Iraqi officers, about their professionality. If we talk about the war between Iran and Iraq for 8 years, yeah, it had negative side, but also it had positive side. Iraqi soldiers or army leaders or whatever, they got very good experience in the field. And every sectors of the army or the process or operation they did in the field. So it means they gain experience as army, as professional workers in the army. I'm talking about this issue. I'm not talking about human rights or, yeah, we have negative things. We will not talk about it in this time.
All right.
So the professionality of the Iraqi army was, I guess, it was the best in the region. Now, if they we are talking about the recruitment criteria now. If the government and the parliament and the ministries, instead, one of them is the Interior Ministry and the Defense Ministry, they all are controlled with the quota. The quota means you have to put Sunni and Shia and Kurd. So this really problematic. This is really will not build a strong professional army, because the big question is, where is the loyalty of those officers? Do they have loyalty to Iraq, or they have loyalty to their parties or their sectarian leaders? This is really dangerous.
All right,
this
Patrick
is what
Paulson,
I'm talking about.
Let me put it to you. I mean, when we look to the future and the composition of the army and the status of the different ethnicities, what you have to bring it back to is the status of the government again. And surely one of the essential points that George Bush always stressed, and one of the essential points of running a country, is that the government has got to be stable, and stability depends upon the ability to resolve the fight over power and the ability to resolve the fight over the distribution of resources and the handing out of political power amongst different interest groups. Iraq has displayed very clearly that it doesn't have that capacity. 6 months after the election, there is no government, there is no consensus, and there appears to be no ability to do that. So when you speak of progress, how can we make progress where there isn't even a decision-making capacity?
Iraqis are learning how to share power.
How?
For many
Justify
years
that comment.
Saddam
How are they
Hussein
doing that 6 months into an election, post-election, and they still can't agree?
6 months into the election, they are arguing about how to share power after a very divided election. That's much better than having a winner-takes-all situation in which one leader is in power and everybody else is crushed. They're having to share power. That's a very difficult process. And just as it took 5 months in Holland to come up with a government, just as in Japan, they've had 5 leaders in 4 years, so too in Iraq, with a very divided situation, it's taking time to form a government. This is an experience that many countries go through.
Faiza Al-Ariji, let me bring you in here because you clearly don't agree with this. The situation, is it comparable to the situation in Holland, do you think? Is that a relevant comparison?
No, the country now is weak and divided. And as I speak in my last interview, I said, now the key of the solution of Iraq is not in the hands of the Iraqi political leaders. It is in the hands of the countries around Iraq. It is in the hand of Iran and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Syria and Turkey and maybe Israel and plus the United States. It means those Iraqi political leaders, they are lost. They are lost because they can't control the country. We are now like Lebanon. If you want to form a government, you have to consult Saudi Arabia and Iran and Syria and others. So they put Iraq in this complicated situation, and they said Iraqis are learning how to share the power. This is not true. They are not learning. They are fighting. They have this long argument, and Iraqi people are tired. This is not the real democratic process. This is not a real political process. It is something like crazy. It is the wrong way. It is not the thing we dream. We have sacrificed years from our life, billions of dollars, millions of Iraqis dead, and we are still learning how to share power?
Let me put this to Mr. Al-Sheikli then, in Baghdad. Obviously, she's right. At the end of the day, there are more interest groups in Iraq than simply Mr. Alawi and Mr. al-Maliki. What about Turkey? What about Iran? What about Saudi Arabia? How are they going to influence the process?
Okay, well, I think she's right. We couldn't deny the international influence and also the regional influence here in Iraq upon the political process. And unfortunately, most of our political parties try to get their support from outside more than getting it from the Iraqi people, which they are elected them. There is a fact, we couldn't pass it, and I think the others will agree with me. There is something not written within the constitution, but they try to make it a fact here in Iraq. The prime minister must be Shia, and that's why the alliances, between the Shia parties began, and of course with the support of the Iranian against Alawi list. And of course, maybe they are right a little bit, because there is nobody can govern the Shia street here in Iraq, just a Shia prime minister.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you there.
At the end,
we are almost out of time. I just want to put one final question to Patrick Clausen then. This influence of Iran in particular is something that America is very concerned about. Let me ask you this. If we see the Sadrist group gaining significant power in government, somehow having more influence than America would like to see, can we really see Washington being as strategically interested in Iraq as it is now? Do you think that there will be the same support for the status quo if we see Mr. al-Maliki giving in to Sadrist pressure?
Basically, yes. The fact is that Mr. Sadr is an Iraqi nationalist. He's not a pawn of the Iranians. He doesn't get along terribly well with the Iranians. And in what has defined him is, in fact, his Iraqi nationalism. So Iraqi nationalism is not something which is going to be comfortable with the idea of Iranians running Baghdad. And the Americans are quite comfortable that at the end of the day, the Iraqis are going to control their own country. As Vice President Biden said the other day, the Iranians have gotten very little for all the money they've spent trying to get influence in Iraq.
Interesting point, though. I mean, why is it then that the Americans are still demonizing Iran's involvement in Iraq to such a great extent? It would seem a lot of policymakers in Washington wouldn't agree with your analysis there.
Well, listen to Vice President Biden, and what he said is that the Iranians try very hard, but they get very little. And unfortunately, what the Iranians do is support violent groups as well as to provide money to politicians. And we don't think that that's appropriate. We think that Iran should instead be helping to build the country of Iraq. Its neighbor.
I will have to cut you off there. We have run out of time. I would like to thank all of you. Patrick Clausen in Washington, D.C., Faiza Al-Ariji in Amman, and in Baghdad, Tahsin Al-Sheikhli. And finally, a reminder that you can always watch the show online. Go to our website, aljazeera.net/English. But that's it for this week's show. Join us again next week when we'll take another look inside Iraq. Bye-bye.